The pink slip arrived on a Tuesday. It came with a short email from HR, a severance check that wouldn't even cover next month's mortgage, and an overwhelming sense of dread. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at a $200 grocery receipt, picking at a salad that somehow cost $7 just because it had fresh tomatoes. It was absurd. That night, an idea took root. The next morning, I drove to the nearest home improvement store and loaded up my trunk with plastic planters, soil, and vegetable seedlings. My driveway got 6 hours of perfect sunlight daily. Why waste it? If I could grow even a little of my own food, I'd be saving money. Within a week, I had 2 neat rows of containers filled with tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and herbs. My first harvest saved me $43 compared to store prices, and for the first time in weeks, I felt in control of something. Neighbors started to take notice. Some stopped to chat, asking for gardening tips. Old Mr. Garcia from next door even gifted me tomato cages he wasn't using anymore. It felt good, like I was building something positive. And then came the camera clicks. One afternoon, as I watered my plants, Patricia Wilson from across the street stood on her pristine lawn, snapping pictures of my driveway with her phone. She wore her usual tennis whites, her blonde bob perfectly still despite the breeze. Beautiful day, isn't it? I called out, waving. Patricia's smile was tight. Just documenting some concerns of community meeting, she replied before turning sharply and walking away. That night, an email appeared in my inbox from Richard Thompson, the HOA president. Subject, violation notice. Attention homeowner at 476 Oakwood Drive. Residential properties must maintain aesthetic standards according to our community guidelines. Your driveway setup violates Code 15-3. Please remedy within 7 days. I flipped through the HOA handbook. Twice. Nothing specifically prohibited container gardens. Section 15-3 only mentioned keeping driveways clear of long-term storage items. These weren't storage items. They were actively growing food. The next morning, a handwritten note was taped to my mailbox. Gardens belong in backyards, not where everyone has to see them. Concerned neighbor. I recognized Patricia's handwriting from last year's Christmas card. Things escalated quickly. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived citing my agricultural activities as inconsistent with the neighborhood's residential character. A $100 daily fine would begin next week if I didn't comply. My stomach knotted as I calculated my dwindling savings. That night, I researched HOA laws until 2 a.m., learning about reasonable restrictions versus overreach. I printed out the county's definition of landscaping, which explicitly mentioned container gardening as permitted in residential zones. The next day, I walked the neighborhood, taking pictures of every overlooked violation. Holiday decorations still up in April, unapproved lawn ornaments, basketball hoops in driveways. They weren't enforcing rules, they were targeting me. I drafted a response to Richard, citing county regulations and pointing out their selective enforcement. Before sending it, I knocked on Mr. Garcia's door. They're targeting you because Patricia wants to win the Neighborhood Beautification Award next month, he said, pouring me a cup of coffee. Your driveway is part her view, and she's been complaining to anyone who'll listen. But it's just vegetables, I protested. Mr. Garcia sighed. Richard always sighed with Patricia. Her husband plays golf with him every Sunday. 2 days of silence followed. Then, early Saturday morning, my doorbell rang. Richard and Patricia stood on my porch. "We've received your response," Richard said, not quite meeting my eyes. "The board has decided to schedule a special hearing about your situation." "This isn't personal," Patricia added, though her tight smile suggested otherwise. "We just care deeply about maintaining community standards." I noticed her phone partially hidden behind her purse. Recording. "I understand caring about our community," I said, keeping my voice calm. "That's why I'm growing healthy food instead of letting my driveway sit empty. Nothing in our bylaws prohibits container gardens." Richard's face reddened. "The board interprets the rules, not individual homeowners." The hearing is Tuesday at 7 p.m. As they walked away, I heard Patricia whisper, "I told you they wouldn't cooperate." That afternoon, I found 5 neighbors with sudden violation notices on their doors. People who had stopped to admire my garden. Someone was sending a message. Word spread fast. That evening, 8 neighbors gathered at my house, all holding HOA violation notices for things that had never been an issue before. They only care about rules when it benefits them. James, who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, said. Richard built a shed twice the allowed size, and the board gave him a special exception, Sophia added. And Patricia's koi pond needed a variance, Dave chimed in, but that was approved in record time. We agreed to attend the HOA hearing together and challenge their tactics. Strength in numbers seemed like our best strategy. That night, I stayed up late, documenting every inconsistency with photos, dates, and references to the bylaws. I wasn't just defending my garden anymore. I was standing up for all of us. The next morning, a landscaping truck parked in front of my house. 2 men in uniforms approached. HOA sent us to remove unauthorized plantings, the taller one said, handing me a work order signed by Richard. You don't have permission to touch anything on my property. I replied firmly, please leave now. They exchanged looks. We were told the homeowner had been notified. The second man said, I've received notices, but I'm contesting them for selective enforcement. I explained, if you remove anything without my permission, it's destruction of private property. They hesitated. Then, without another word, they packed up their truck and left. An hour later, I received an email from Richard. Your refusal to comply leaves us no choice but to pursue all available remedies. That afternoon, I noticed Patricia leading 3 women on a tour of the neighborhood. When they reached my house, she pointed dramatically at my garden. The women shook their heads in mock disapproval. That evening, another certified letter arrived. Cease and desist. Remove all agricultural implements within 48 hours or face legal action. That's when I decided it was time to go beyond the HOA handbook. I called the County Housing Authority. HOAs have power, but they're not above the law, Marcus, a clerk, explained. Check if your subdivision has any agricultural heritage protections in its original plan. Agricultural heritage? I asked. Some developments were built on old farmland, he said. There might be special clauses protecting your right to grow food. My heart pounded. Could this be the loophole I needed? I rushed to the county records office just before closing time. Flipping through dusty pages, I froze. Section 8. In accordance with the County Agricultural Heritage Protection Act, homeowners retain the right to cultivate food-producing plants on their property. This right shall not be infringed by any future homeowners association. I snapped photos of every page. This wasn't just a loophole. This changed everything. Homeowners retain the right to cultivate food-producing plants on their property. This right shall not be infringed by any future homeowners association. This wasn't just a loophole. This was law. And the HOA had completely ignored it. As I drove home, my mind raced. If they had overlooked this, what else had they gotten away with? Back at my house, I opened my laptop and dove into HOA case laws. The more I read, the clearer it became. HOAs can't selectively enforce rules. They can't make up new restrictions that contradict county laws. And they definitely can't physically block someone's access to their property. The next morning, I met with my lawyer, Sarah Jenkins, the best property rights attorney in the county. After scanning the documents, she started laughing. In 15 years of HOA cases, I've never seen such a massive mistake. Her eyes sparkled as she tapped a section of the contract. They legally cannot force you to remove that garden. And those spike strips? That's unlawful detainment, possibly even criminal. I sat up straighter. So what do we do? Sarah grinned. We fight back. That night, I called my neighbors and invited them over. When they arrived, I spread out the HOA's inconsistencies on my dining table, photos, dates, and legal documents. I found proof, I told them. They've been selectively enforcing rules and violating our property rights. We don't just have a case, we have a way to stop them. Ellie, my next-door neighbor, shook her head. So many of us have been bullied by them for years. It's time we do something. Dave, the guy with the basketball hoop violation, clenched his jaw. I'm sick of them using these rules like weapons. We made a plan. Show up in force at the HOA hearing. Let them see we weren't just fighting for one garden. We were fighting for our entire community. But Richard and Patricia, they weren't done playing dirty. The next morning, as I poured my coffee, a metallic scraping sound outside made my stomach drop. I ran to the window. Two men in bright yellow Maple Creek maintenance vests were installing spike strips along my driveway. Not warning signs, not barriers. Spike strips. I stormed outside. Hey, stop that right now. The older worker barely looked up. Just following HOA orders, ma'am. Nothing personal. Orders for what? I snapped. To trap me in my own home? The younger worker at least had the decency to look embarrassed. It's called property demarcation for code violations. I grabbed my phone and started recording. This is illegal. You are physically blocking my vehicle. The older man sighed. Ma'am, we're just doing our job. I called the police. 20 minutes later, Officer Martinez arrived. He frowned at the sharp metal teeth lining my driveway. And they did this because of a garden? He asked, scratching his head. Yes, I said. And now I can't leave my own property without destroying my tires. Officer Martinez exhaled sharply. That does seem excessive. He flipped through his notepad. I understand your frustration, but HOA disputes are civil matters. I recommend taking this up with the board directly. I clenched my jaw. That's exactly what they want me to do. But I have a better idea. Instead of arguing with Richard and Patricia, I drove my riding lawnmower to my neighbor Ellie's house and borrowed her car. Then I went straight to the county records office. I spent hours combing through subdivision maps, original property agreements, and county regulations. And then I found it, a forgotten clause buried in the Maple Creek Estate's planning documents. The land was originally designated as agricultural property, which meant every homeowner in this subdivision legally had the right to grow food. Any HOA rule attempting to restrict that was void. I snapped dozens of pictures and emailed them to Sarah. Her response came fast. We just won your case. Get ready. But before I could celebrate, something even worse happened. That night, my phone security alert woke me up. I checked the footage and felt ice run through my veins. Patricia's husband, Tom, was in my yard cutting through my irrigation lines. I immediately called the police. Officer Martinez arrived within minutes. Tom barely had time to stammer out an excuse before he was caught on camera red-handed. As he was being questioned, Patricia stormed outside in her silk bathrobe. My husband was just checking for rats, she snapped. Officer Martinez held up the garden shears Tom had been using. With these, ma'am. Patricia's face turned beet red. We told her that garden was a problem. Officer Martinez nodded. And you just made it a legal one. Tom was taken in for vandalism. That morning, I uploaded a single photo of the spike strips to our neighborhood social media group. Caption, "Is this how HOA should solve disputes over vegetable gardens?" The post exploded. By noon, reporters from Channel 7 News were on my front lawn. And that's when Richard and Patricia lost it. A black SUV screeched to a halt across the street. Patricia practically flew out of the passenger door, Richard right behind her. Turn those cameras off. Richard barked, storming across my lawn. This is a private neighborhood matter. The reporter's eyes gleamed. Mr. Thompson, as HOA president, did you authorize the installation of these tire-puncturing devices? Patricia shoved in front of the microphone. She's violating community standards. That garden is a disgrace. The camera zoomed in on my perfectly maintained tomato plants. I took a slow breath and said, calmly, for the whole world to hear, these violations help feed my family. And nothing in the HOA guidelines prohibits container gardening. The media firestorm that followed, Richard and Patricia never saw it coming. By the time my emergency hearing was scheduled, the entire county was watching. News channels replayed footage of the spike strips, interviews with neighbors, and Patricia's meltdown on my front lawn. Social media tore the HOA apart, with hundreds of comments questioning how an association could have so much unchecked power. I arrived at the courthouse with Sarah, my lawyer, by my side. As we stepped inside, I expected a quiet legal proceeding. Instead, I found myself facing over 20 of my neighbors, all sitting behind me in support. And on the other side, Richard, Patricia, and their high-powered attorney, a sleek man in an expensive suit who whispered furiously in Richard's ear. They looked confident, smug, even until Judge Watkins walked in. She took her seat and adjusted her glasses. "Before we begin, I want to make something very clear," she said, her voice sharp. "I reviewed the evidence until midnight, and I am deeply troubled by what I've seen." Richard's lawyer stood up smoothly. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not." The judge cut him off with a glare. Then she turned toward Richard. "Did you authorize the installation of these spike strips?" Richard straightened his tie. "Yes, Your Honor, but they are designed to puncture tires." The judge's voice was ice. "Did you or did you not intend to prevent the plaintiff from using her vehicle?" Richard hesitated. Patricia jumped up. She was breaking the rules. "We gave her multiple warnings." Bang! The judge's gavel struck the desk. "Mrs. Davis, you are not recognized to speak. Sit down." Silence. Then Sarah stood and presented our trump card, the original subdivision documents proving the HOA's rules were void. Patricia's face turned red. Richard's lawyer paled. And then came the final blow. Security footage from the night Patricia's husband vandalized my garden. It played on the courtroom screen. The sound of snipping irrigation lines filled the room. Judge Watkins turned to Patricia. "Your husband admitted you asked him to handle the garden situation. Care to explain?" Patricia stared at the floor. After just 40 minutes of arguments, the judge delivered her ruling. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff." My heart pounded as she continued. The HOA's actions were unlawful detainment, harassment, and a violation of property rights. The spike strips would be removed immediately within the hour. The HOA would pay $155,000 in damages. All my legal fees would be reimbursed. And most importantly, new HOA board elections would be held within 30 days. Richard's face turned ashen. Patricia buried her face in her hands. "Your Honor," Richard's lawyer began, voice shaking, "we intend to appeal." "That is your right." The judge nodded. "However, the removal order and election requirement will not be delayed. And if there is any further harassment, this court will not hesitate to hold your clients in contempt." The case was closed. When I pulled onto my street that afternoon, I thought I was dreaming. A crowd of neighbors was waiting for me. At first, my stomach dropped. Had Patricia organized a protest? But then I heard it. Applause. Cheers. Ellie ran up to my car. "We watched the live stream," she said, grinning. "You did it." Officer Martinez was already supervising a maintenance crew removing the spike strips. Dave, the guy with the basketball hoop violation, handed me a ceramic planter painted with sunflowers. "For our neighborhood's defender," he said. Tears filled my eyes. But the biggest surprise? Ellie and her husband held up a handmade wooden sign that read, "Maple Creek Community Gardens, growing together. We found an unused lot behind the playground," she explained. 50 neighbors signed up to start a community garden. We never knew about that agricultural heritage law. It wasn't just my garden that had been saved. The whole community was changing. Over the next few weeks, the HOA completely unraveled. Richard resigned from the board. Patricia went silent. She still lived across the street, but now crossed to the other side when she saw me. The new HOA board, led by Dave and Mrs. Johnson, overturned every unfair fine from the past year. And the community garden? It was approved unanimously. Even Tom, Patricia's husband, had to complete community service hours, which, ironically, involved building raised garden beds for project. Turns out he was great at carpentry. Patricia tried to save face, but her neighbors had seen the truth. Slowly, people started pulling away from her. The final blow came 3 months later, when a young couple toured a house down the block. Their real estate agent? Patricia's own sister. "I love this neighborhood," the wife said, eyeing the new community garden. "We've been looking for a place just like this." Patricia stood frozen. For years, she claimed my garden was destroying property values. Now, it was making people want to move in. Months later, I got a shocking text from Sarah. Guess what? State legislature just introduced the Homeowner Food Freedom Act, and they mention your case by name. I stare at my phone, then at my thriving driveway garden, then beyond it at the new community garden, where neighbors worked together, children ran between rows of sunflowers, and people finally felt free. I never imagined a few tomato plants could change an entire neighborhood. But sometimes, standing up for something small creates a ripple effect you never expect. And to think, it all started because Patricia Davis was so obsessed with trophy. She never thought to check the actual law. I smiled, remembering something my grandfather always said. Before you try to dig up someone else's garden, make sure you know whose land you're standing on.